Don Sutton, exactly. Don Sutton may be the greatest Major League Baseball player that no one has ever heard of. Actually, that may be an overstatement, but one thing is for certain. Don Sutton's career accomplishments have gone relatively unnoticed by many people in the world. You see, Don Sutton was a grinder. He was someone who just got the job done. But in his 21-year Major League career, his accomplishments are rather lackluster. One of the metrics that baseball critics use to measure the success of a pitcher is 20-win seasons. Don Sutton had one in 21 years of play. Another metric is no-hitters. Don Sutton never threw a no-hitter. But in 1986, he rubbed elbows with baseball's elite as he became a member of the 300-win club, another metric that is used to gauge the success of a pitcher. Only 24 pitchers in the history of the major leagues have 300 wins or more, and Don Sutton is one of them. Here's how he described his career. I am a grinder and a mechanic. I never considered myself flamboyant or exceptional, but all my life, I found a way to get the job done. And get it done he did. Through 6 presidential terms, 2 decades, 4 trades to other teams, all he did was consistently get the job done. And in a 1986 edition of Inside Sports Magazine, it is said that he is the family sedan of baseball. That he's not a Porsche or a Ferrari like Sandy Koufax or Nolan Ryan, but rather he's more like a Toyota Camry. Not real fancy, just trusty and reliable. And the guy that we're going to look at this morning from Scripture could be described that same way. Trusty and reliable. He didn't burst onto the scene in some great way. He didn't make a huge splash. Although he is well known, it's not because he slayed a giant or because he defeated an invading army. No, what makes this person stand out is his integrity. We start a series this morning that over the next few weeks we'll be looking at integrity. If we're going to be a people who is all out, then we're going to have to be people of integrity. If we're going to make a difference outside these walls, then we're going to be people of integrity. How do we define integrity? We need a working definition, don't we? So here's the working definition of integrity. It's doing the right thing because it's the right thing to do. Or we could describe it this way. It's doing what you ought to, even if it costs you. You know, in engineering, there's this thing called structural integrity. And structural integrity refers to a structure's ability to hold together against a load, maybe even its own weight, without breaking, without a fracture or a fatigue. When the structural integrity of a thing is compromised, the load is transferred and potentially overloads supporting structures. And people are no different. A failure in integrity adds stress to those around us. Integrity is personal, but it's not private. It's never isolated. The load is always transferred. So not doing what you ought to do will always cost someone else. We could put it this way. Your irresponsibility becomes someone else's responsibility. When I was a teenager, I didn't always do the right thing. I didn't always make good decisions. My irresponsibility became my parents' responsibility. And it caused them a lot of stress and angst. That's how integrity works. So it's not just about me. Strong integrity has the potential to strengthen those around me. And weak integrity has the potential to burden those around me. So let's turn our attention to a person of incredible integrity. Daniel chapter 1. And before we read, let's just kind of set the stage, okay? The time is 605 BC. The king of Babylon is Nebuchadnezzar, and he is on a winning streak. He has defeated the Egyptians and what was left of the Assyrian army. He now turns his sights toward Judah and the capital, which is Jerusalem, and he takes their king and hauls him back to Babylon because Nebuchadnezzar had this weird obsession with kings. Anytime he took over and invaded a territory or a nation, he would take the king and he would put him in prison, and then at parties he would parade these kings out just to show how powerful he was and to brag to his friends. And so he takes the king, and also, as he conquers this nation, he takes others captive as well. Notice what is written, verse 3 and following. Then the king told Ashpenaz, the chief of his officials, to bring in some of the sons of Israel, including some of the royal family and of the nobles, youths in whom there was no impairment, who were good-looking, suitable for instruction in every kind of expertise, endowed with understanding and discerning knowledge, and who had the ability to serve in the king's court. And he ordered Ashpenaz to teach them the literature and language of the Chaldeans. The king also allotted for them a daily ration for the king's choice food and from the wine which he drank, and ordered that they be educated for 3 years, at the end of which they would enter into the king's personal service. So Nebuchadnezzar was a smart guy. Instead of just laying waste to everything and killing everyone in the nation that he invaded, he would take some of the best and the brightest, especially of the young people, with him to serve in his court. So he would find these young men that had so much potential because of their intellect, because of their talents and their abilities, and he would take them with him and he would train them up. And so as a result, Babylon was a very cosmopolitan place. And if you're one of these young men, you hit the lottery. And you think, well, Chris, that's strange. You just got taken into captivity. Yes, but you're not going to be exposed to doing backbreaking work in the oppressive heat day in and day out. You're going to be taken care of, living in the lap of luxury in the king's palace as they train you to use you for their service. So if you're the son and you're being taken into captivity to be raised up in the king's court, your dad is probably going to say something to you like, hey, son, don't mess this up. You've got a real opportunity here. Don't mess this up. Just do as you're told, right? And so Daniel is part of the Fab Four. You remember who the other three were? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, right? So that's the Fab Four, and they were the brightest of the bright. They were the bestest of the best, right? They were singled out, and the king changes their names. And the reason he changes their names is because changing the name implies ownership. If you adopt a dog at the pound, you may not like the name that dog is given. And so when you take it home, you give it a new name, and you can do that. You know why? Because it's your dog, and because you own it now. And so that's why the king changed their names, is because it showed that they are now his property. They belong to him. And as long as they obey, as long as they do what the king tells them to do, they're going to be in good standing and everything's going to be fine. So Daniel and his friends have it made. You can have your name changed. That's annoying. But at the end of the day, it's a small price to pay for living in the lap of luxury. But here's where the story takes a turn. Notice verse 8. But Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the king's choice food or with the wine which he drank. So he sought permission from the commander of the officials that he might not defile himself. So in a couple of weeks, we're going to talk about another man who compromised his integrity for a bowl of stew. That guy's name was Esau, and you think, really? Like you give up your rights for a bowl of stew? And we might think the same thing about Daniel here. Really, Daniel? Can't you just go along? Can't you just kind of cross your fingers behind your back because God knows your heart and just eat the food? I mean, you're going to mess this whole thing up. It's just food, right? But notice again verse 8. But Daniel made up his mind that he would not defile himself with the king's choice food or with the wine which he drank. The ESV states it like this. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. The King James. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's meat, nor with the wine which he drank. So a new home, a new education, a new name were one thing. But Daniel drew the line when it came to the king's menu. Under the law of Moses, there were certain foods on the king's diet plan that were forbidden for Daniel to eat. As a Hebrew, he would be compromising his faith by eating these foods. And so, in reviewing the king's edict, Daniel decided that the choice was clear. He couldn't do it. He couldn't adhere to the king's diet. You see, when we sit down to eat, we often say a prayer that goes something like this. Dear God, please bless this food to the nourishment of our bodies. And there is a chain of events, really, whether you realize it or not, that you are going through when you pray that prayer. We're thanking God who provided the food because he provided the rain and the way for the crops to grow, and we ingest the food, and when we ingest the food, it makes us strong so that we can serve God to the fullest. Well, in Nebuchadnezzar's chain of events, the big G God was not the God that they would be praying to. Instead, it would be a god by the name of Marduk, the god of the Babylonians. So Marduk provides the food, which goes into your body, which strengthens you so that you can serve Marduk, right? Daniel, by ingesting this food, would be admitting that this little g God was greater than his big G God. For Daniel, there was no way that he was going to pay homage to a God that was nothing more than a figment of their imagination. Although some may have been looking around and saying, well, Marduk seems to be more in control than God. I mean, here we are in captivity, and God doesn't seem to be concerned about it. But Daniel made up his mind ahead of time, and that is a key cog in this whole wheel. Daniel made up his mind ahead of time to not partake of this food. It wasn't really about food anyway. It was about something deeper. It was about who ruled Daniel's life. And because the big G God sat on the throne of his heart, there wasn't room for any of these little g gods, including Marduk. But here's the deal. Daniel didn't make up his mind in the moment. Did you notice that? It says he made up his mind ahead of time. He didn't make up his mind in the moment. This decision was made long before this moment. Daniel made up his mind before there was ever a story about Daniel. Before we ever had a book of the Bible named Daniel. Before he even knew the story about Daniel, Daniel made up his mind. In fact, the only reason we have a story about Daniel is because he made up his mind ahead of time. Reminds me of the story of the hunter who was living deep in the woods, and winter was coming, and he wanted to stay warm, and so he thought, well, I'll kill a bear, and I'll use its hide to cover up with and keep warm during the winter. So he's out hunting, and lo and behold, he sees a big bear, and he raises up his gun to shoot it, and the bear sees him and says, whoa, 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 please, don't shoot. Why do you want to shoot me? And the hunter says, well, to be honest with you, I'm cold, and I want to keep warm for the winter. And the bear says, well, I'm hungry. Maybe we can come to a compromise. And they did. The bear ate the hunter, so he was no longer hungry, and the hunter was no longer cold. There are some things where maybe you can strike a deal, or maybe you can compromise. But not so when it comes to our faith and our spirituality. There are some things that cannot be bartered, and loyalty to God is one of them. Daniel had an airtight conviction, and there was no settlement to be reached when it came to his God versus Babylon's God. This was an area of non-compliance, end of story, period, exclamation point. In fact, there would be no story of Daniel if he had compromised on the food. No lion's den, no interpreting the king's dreams, no rising to prominence in the king's palace, no being used by God to tell his story. If Daniel had not made up his mind ahead of time and drawn this line in the sand, he would have forfeited the opportunity to write a story worth reading. Because, please hear me on this, when you do what you ought to do, even if it costs you, you write a story that is worth reading and a story that is worth remembering. Now, a breach in integrity tells a story as well. Not a story worth remembering, but it tells a story nonetheless. And a breach in integrity usually leads to another breach in integrity. Have you noticed that? So you have a breach in integrity, and then you have a second, then you have a third, then you have a fourth. You have this pattern that develops. Typically, one breach in integrity is going to lead to several others, and each breach makes it easier to settle for less than what God expects. We sacrifice our integrity, and when we do, we close the book. You never know the story that could have been told. Now, God will use your breach of integrity to tell a story, because he can use whatever to tell a story, but it may not be a story worth reading. When the Civil War broke out, there was a young man that didn't want to fight. He didn't want to pick a side. He didn't want to be involved, and so he decided to wear a Confederate coat and Union trousers, and guess what? He got shot by both sides. Because this is an all or nothing commitment. Some things are like that. You just have to choose whether you want to or not. You have to pick a side, and that's the choice when it comes for us as Christians. You've got to pick a side. You can't be neutral. You can't be Switzerland. You have to pick a side. You have to choose. And Daniel chose the one true God, no matter what. No matter what, he was on the side of God. He made up his mind ahead of time, knowing full well that it might limit his time. Because Daniel didn't know if God would intervene. He had hoped he would intervene. I'm sure he prayed that he would intervene, but he didn't know he would. Yet he still made up his mind ahead of time, even though there was no guarantee that God would step in and protect Daniel. Integrity is doing the right thing even if it costs you, and there is no guarantee that it won't cost you. However, no matter the cost, it is always worth the risk. It is always in our best interest to place our lives in the hands of God and let Him do what He intends. I want you to notice something else about Daniel's integrity. Continue reading with me in verse 9. Now God granted Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the commander of the officials. The commander of the officials said to Daniel, I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has allotted your food and your drink, for why should he see your faces looking gaunt in comparison to the youths who are your own age? Then you would make me forfeit my head to the king. But Daniel said to the overseer, whom the commander of the officials had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please put your servants to the test for 10 days, and let us be given some vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance be examined in your presence, and the appearance of the youths who are eating the king's choice food, and deal with your servants according to what you see. Now, here's what I love about Daniel, among the many things I love about Daniel, is that in this moment, after resolving not to defile himself with the king's food, he doesn't go on a hunger strike. He doesn't do some radical protest. He simply goes to the commander and he respectfully shares his dilemma with him. Now, the commander is rightfully concerned because if this doesn't work, his neck is on the line. If he allows Daniel to do this 10-day diet plan and he looks gaunt or he's all frail, then the king is going to hold him accountable. But Daniel believes in this plan, and he has full confidence that God's going to work this out. Even though God had not promised to intervene, Daniel was confident that the story would play out in his favor, and it was God's story anyway. And when God writes your story, it's always going to work out, isn't it? You know, primarily there are 3 reactions when your faith is put to the test, right? And those 3 reactions are either to separate, to assimilate, or exacerbate. Now, isolation is a tactic that is, separation is a tactic, or isolation, that has been used through the years by many religious folks. I think about monks living in monastic societies, or nuns joining convents, or perhaps hermits living in isolation. Even as Christians, there are times where we separate ourselves from the world around us because sometimes you have to do that, right? You filter what you listen to, you filter what you watch, maybe even you'll filter where you go, because we understand that as Christians, sometimes you do have to kind of separate. However, even though separation may be a part of our tactic as a Christian, it's not always the best approach, because at some point, you have to be in the world to affect the world, right? Some of our modern day churches have become places of separation and isolation where Christians gather together and they stay inward focused instead of having any outward focus. Separation can be a good thing. It can be a necessary thing, but not always, because even though, like Daniel, we have to draw some lines, we also can't affect change if we're not out there among those who need the change. If we don't go, then who will? Another tactic is assimilation. We can assimilate and become chameleon Christians, where we just blend in with the environment around us. But I think we all know that that's not healthy either. You know, it's kind of this idea that you just go along to get along. Better to go along with the crowd than to stick out like a sore thumb. We don't want people thinking we're some holy roller or some Jesus freak. It would be much easier to justify our predicament by just saying, look, God knows my heart. I don't want to cause any waves. Daniel could have done that. Daniel could have just gone along with the crowd. God knows my heart. I'll pray about this later and ask for forgiveness. And then you have exacerbate. You know what exacerbate is? It's when you make a bad situation worse. And unfortunately, some Christians have done that through the years. They make a bad situation worse by trying to beat people into submission with the truth. You know, the Bible is a sword, all right. And some Christians use it to cut others to pieces. Instead of preaching the truth or speaking the truth in love, we'd rather cut down those who disagree with us. But I love how Daniel handles the situation. He was resourceful and respectful. He handled a difficult situation, not with gall, but with grace. So, here's the question that is on the table this morning. And every week during this series, there will be a question attached to what we're talking about or who we're talking about. And the question on the table this morning is, who do you want to be? Who do you want to be? And it's important for you to decide that now, not to wait. Daniel didn't make up his mind in the heat of the moment. He made up his mind ahead of time, and it made all the difference. Daniel isn't meant to be admired. He's not meant to be applauded. Do you know why his story is included in the Bible? So that it will be imitated. That's why. He's not meant to be appreciated. He's meant to be imitated. He's not meant to be applauded. He's meant to be modeled. That is absolutely why God told his story. So that we would soak it in, we would reflect on it, and we would apply it to our lives. Look with me at verse 21 of chapter 1. Let's skip down a little bit. Verse 21 says, "And Daniel continued until the first year of Cyrus the king." So this may be a little inconsequential, but I think it's interesting. Do you know how long it was from the time that Daniel was carried away into captivity till the time of King Cyrus? You know how long that timeline was? 70 years. For 70 years, Daniel has the king's ear. Think about that. For 70 years, Daniel is in the ear of the king, Nebuchadnezzar, Darius, or Darius, however you want to say it, and now Cyrus. Daniel was with them all. God had strategically placed Daniel in the palace to be a man of influence to the three most powerful men alive. And guess what set him up for this? Yeah, making up his mind ahead of time. What set him up for all of this is the decision that he made long ago as a teenager, way back in the day. And there would be other decisions along the way that he would refuse to compromise his faith or breach his integrity. But those decisions get easier and easier when you make up your mind ahead of time. Once you've drawn that line in the sand, once you've decided this is the way it's going to be, it gets easier and easier as you go along. Let's jump ahead in Daniel's story all the way to chapter 6. Then this Daniel began distinguishing himself among the commissioners and satraps because he possessed an extraordinary spirit, and the king intended to appoint him over the entire kingdom. Then the commissioners and satraps began trying to find a ground of accusation against Daniel regarding government affairs. But they could not find any ground of accusation or evidence of corruption because he was trustworthy, and no negligence or corruption was to be found in him. Then these men said, "We will not find any ground of accusation against this Daniel unless we find it against him regarding the law of his God." So real quick, here's the setting. Over 50 years have passed since being taken into captivity. The Persians have replaced the Babylonians, and the new king, Darius, decides he's going to reshuffle the empire. And so he appoints 120 governors and 3 administrators over these governors, and then he just goes plays golf, I guess. And here we see that Daniel is one of the 3 administrators over the 120 governors. He's not even from there. He's not technically even one of them. And yet here he has risen to prominence to where he is basically going to be in charge of running the day-to-day activities of the palace, of the kingdom. What got him there? The fact that he made a decision a long time ago, right? Now, of course, these governors don't like it. They're not happy about this. They're jealous of Daniel's rise in prominence. Here he is 70 years old, and he's still got this position where he can influence and have authority. And so they try to find some dirt on Daniel. And guess what? They couldn't find any regarding, it says, government affairs. Daniel had been in government 50 years. Do you know of anybody who's been in government for 50 years who doesn't have any dirt on them whatsoever? You know, anyone who's been in government that long that doesn't have a stain on their record? Surely they could dig into his Twitter, profile from 20 years ago, right, and find something. Surely there's a history somewhere that Daniel messed up. But it says they couldn't find any regarding government affairs. And so they have to turn to his faith. And they figure, well, if we're going to get to Daniel, then we're going to have to drive a wedge between him and God. We got to go after his faith. Look at it again. Then these men said, we will not find any ground of accusation against this Daniel unless we find it against him regarding the law of his God. Daniel's enemies recognized his integrity, and they could see that his integrity was connected to the God that he served. So the only option that they had, it was to get between him and his God. And you can read further to see how that turned out. But spoiler alert, it works out in Daniel's favor because he was a man of integrity, because he made up his mind ahead of time, and he drew that line in the sand. No little g gods, only the big G God. He sits on the throne of my heart, and therefore I'm going to serve him, and I'm going to be a man of integrity so that others can see that I'm attached to him. Back to our question. What do you want to be? What do you want to be? And have you made up your mind? Like I said before, make up your mind ahead of time. Don't wait until you're in the heat of the moment. Daniel was a man of integrity at 70 because he made up his mind at 17. Most people make up their mind in the moment. Many people don't want to make up their mind because it locks them in. It takes away any other options. They want to keep the doors open. If you make up your mind ahead of time, it's going to cost you. If you make up your mind ahead of time, you're going to miss out on some things. And that's okay. Because I think many of you in this room could tell the same story that I can, is that if I had made up my mind at 17 and drawn a line in the sand, I wouldn't be dealing with guilt and shame from decisions that I made a long time ago, right? Yeah, you'll miss out on some things, but that's probably a good thing. Because all of us have some skeletons in our closet, or all of us have some things that we regret that we did early on in life because we didn't make up our mind ahead of time. And we compromised our integrity. Part of it's being young and dumb, I get it. But if you haven't made up your mind, do so today. What do you want to be? There's a movie called To End All Wars. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's about some folks that have been captured by the Japanese during World War II, and they're in this Japanese prison camp, and they're talking about what they're going to do when the war is over and they're released. And one of them says, well, I'm going to get married. Another one says he's going to be a teacher. But then it comes around to the colonel, and he doesn't say anything. And they ask the colonel, so what are you going to do when this war is over? And he responds, prepare for the next war. And I think as Christians, that kind of defines us a little bit, doesn't it? We're just kind of getting ready for the next battle because Satan hasn't stopped. He has his weapons of mass destruction pointed directly at us. And so we can't relax. However, we become successful in this fight by deciding right now what we want to be, who we want to be, by making up our mind ahead of time so that when he attacks, we're protected. What do you want to be? And can we help you get there this morning? If you have a need, why don't you come as we stand and as we sing?